CSS is the language that is used to define the styles of elements on modern web pages. CSS has over 100 different properties that you can use to define styles, and many different CSS techniques are used to create the pages that you see on the internet. Covering every CSS property and technique would be the subject matter for an entire course in itself, but you will briefly cover some of the most important ones in this lesson. As only very basic CSS will be covered in this course, you might not feel entirely confident that you understand it fully. The important thing to take from these CSS lessons is an appreciation of how a professional web designer uses CSS to design attractive and consistent web pages. You do not need an in-depth understanding of CSS in order to work through the rest of this course. Journalists do not get involved with the page layouts of newspapers. This is left to typesetters and page layout artists. But the journalist still needs to know what is possible. In the same way, it isn't essential for a web developer to cultivate extensive web design skills. A reasonable knowledge of how the technologies work will suffice. You've already discovered HTML tables in earlier lessons. Before the advent of CSS, most web designers used HTML tables to arrange their pages neatly into columns. There is now a new way of arranging page elements that relies entirely upon CSS properties. Most web designers have now abandoned table-based layouts and create their layouts entirely with CSS. To begin this lesson, open the HTML test sample file from your sample files folder. And open css-test.aspx in source view. Now you're going to link the css-test.css style sheet to this page. It can be found in the Styles folder. Remember that you can do this very easily by simply dragging css-test.css from the Solution Explorer into the head tag. Next, you're going to create a CSS class. CSS classes are ways of grouping style properties together in CSS and giving them a name. Elements on your pages can then be referenced to the name of the class in order to use its styles. Double-click on css-test.css in the Solution Explorer to open it for editing. Note that the file is currently empty. Now add the following code. Big text, begin curly brackets, font-size, XX large, end curly brackets. You have just created a CSS class called Big Text that makes the text of any HTML tag that references it extra large. Next, you're going to assign your Big Text class to an HTML tag. Reopen css-test.aspx in source view. Click inside the div ID equals div1 line and set the class property to Big Text by typing class equals Big Text. Note that CSS class names are case sensitive, so this wouldn't work without the capital letters. Now switch to Design View, and you can see that the text of all of the elements nested inside div1 have been made extra large by your CSS class. Next, you're going to create a CSS Identifier. Identifiers are similar to classes, but instead of using the class property, they automatically attach themselves to any element with the same ID property. It is easier to understand identifiers by seeing them in action. Reopen csstest.css and add the following CSS code. #div2 begin curly brackets, color white, background color blue, end curly brackets. Now switch back to csstest.aspx in design view. The div2 identifier has set the text color to white and the background color to blue for all elements within the div tag that has an ID property of div2. Finally, you're going to use some inline CSS code. Although it's best practice to keep all of your CSS styles in separate files, you can also place CSS code directly into the style property of an HTML tag. Switch back to Source View and click inside the P tag just before paragraph 1. Now set the style property with the following code. Style equals font size XX small. Now switch back to Design View, and you can see that paragraph 1 has smaller text than the other paragraphs. Inline CSS always overrides any styles that are set by the class property. ASP.NET often automatically generates inline CSS code when converting ASP.NET controls into HTML code. Close Visual Studio now, saving your changes if prompted. And you've now completed Lesson 2.8. Work with CSS.